I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, if you appreciate the work here I do at Parallax Views, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. By the end of the week, beginning of next week, definitely before the end of the month, I know we only have a few days in the month left here, there will be 2 new additions to the Patreon page, an episode with Robbie Martin of Media Roots Radio, and also a new edition of the Parallax Vlog, so look out for those episodes if you're a Patreon supporter at the $5 tier or above. With that out of the way, on this edition of the show, we'll be hearing from Richard Silverstein of the Tikun Olam blog, a blog that covers breaking news related to the Israeli national security state. Richard is also a contributor to Jacobin, sometimes writes at the New Arab and the Middle East Eye as well, and we're going to be talking about the non-destruction of Iran's nuclear site. Contrary to what Donald Trump is saying publicly, it appears that the nuclear site remains intact. We'll discuss that, as well as some other issues, including disaster humanitarianism in Gaza and how Israel's Shin Bet is involved in that. All that and much more in the conversation to follow with Richard Silverstein. And with that being said, let's get right to it. Welcome back to Parallax Views, a guest that I always enjoy having on. He's a regular here. It's been a little bit of time, though, since we've last had him on. Richard Silverstein of the Tikun Olam blog, a blog dealing with breaking news on the Israeli national security state. Welcome back to Parallax Views.
Thank you. It's good to be here with you.
So, Richard, before we get into the article you sent me from Foreign Policy that you said was very significant, maybe you could just give your thoughts on what has transpired the past, week or two, because it has been pretty crazy. I thought we were going to be in World War III for a second there.
Yeah. Well, Trump and Netanyahu have been conniving together to do a number on Iran and its nuclear program. And so Netanyahu and both Netanyahu and Trump have been sort of spewing a lot of propaganda about the Iranian program and saying that they're weeks or days away from having a nuclear weapon, all of which is false for many reasons. But so Trump entered into negotiations with Iran about trying to eliminate its nuclear program, which of course the Iranians refused to do because it's an invasion of their sovereignty, to be sort of cowed by foreign power like the United States. And once it was clear to Trump that Iran was not going to agree to eliminate its nuclear program, he basically decided that he was going to let Israel loose on Iran. And then that's what happened. There was a surprise strike by Israel against various targets in Iran, and they assassinated much of the military command and also many nuclear scientists. And then Trump thought or claimed that this attack was going to bring Iran back to the negotiating table and all of a sudden clarify Iranian mind about the danger and that they were going to give up their program. And that didn't happen. So Trump himself engaged in a surprise attack. This one was using the mass ordnance, I forget what is it, MOP, the bunker buster bomb. That's 30,000 pounds of TNT on 12 of them on Iranian nuclear sites, on 3 sites The main one was called Fordow, and they dropped, I don't know, 6 or 7 of those 12 on this one plant, which is the main uranium enrichment site in Iran, and it's 300 feet below the surface, and it's reinforced by concrete and all sorts of materials that are supposed to withstand that kind of attack. And it appears from 2 different sources, at least, that the U.S. and Israel together, well, let's just talk about the U.S. since they bombed the nuclear sites, that the U.S. did minimal damage or limited damage to Iran's entire nuclear program. So
And
despite the fact,
this was in the foreign policy article you sent me by Jeffrey Lewis. Iran is on course for, or yeah, Iran is on course for a bomb after U.S. strikes failed to destroy facilities. The headline here, the subheadline was interesting. Satellite imagery confirms that Iranian capabilities are bruised, not annihilated. So it sounds like the satellite images are the proof in the pudding.
yeah, and Jeffrey Lewis is a nuclear proliferation expert who reads maps for a living. Reads that Maxar technology mapping software that covers the entire globe via satellite, and he's been tracking all this for years. And so he knows what the sites looked like a year ago or a month ago. He knows what they look like today or yesterday, and he can judge what kind of activity is going on based on that. And that's what intelligence analysts do all the time. So it's not like he's doing anything that's extraordinarily unusual. He's just doing what an intelligence analyst would do. And he says basically that the damage done to the nuclear program was limited, that perhaps, and I want to add that he's not the only person to make this kind of assessment. The Defense Intelligence Agency, which is an arm of the Pentagon, released its own assessment, which agreed with Lewis and said that there was limited damage to the program. So the things that they did damage were above ground. And so the other sites are Natanz and Isfahan, and there's another one, and then Fordow. And so the damage was to the buildings above ground. And in Fordow, they closed off the entrance to Fordow, and they took out the electrical system, which is needed for the uranium centrifuges that were enriching it. So there was damage done, no question. But the damage was nowhere near the claims of Netanyahu, and Trump said that they obliterated the Iranian nuclear program and that there is no more program, et cetera, et cetera. And all this is bluff and bluster, which is characteristic of both Trump and Netanyahu. The Lewis and the DIA assessment said that they set back the program by approximately 6 months. Lewis says anywhere from 2 months to a year. So the irony of what Lewis is saying is important, because he said if we had stayed in the JCPOA, the Obama era nuclear deal with Iran, that they would have not gotten to the point that they are now for 10 or 15 years, because that's the span of the agreement. And now they've been set back 6 months or a year, and they're ahead of where they would be if there had been a nuclear agreement. So the claim that they're going to eliminate the nuclear program by air power is ridiculous. The only way to do this is negotiating a deal with Iran. And this is, by the way, something that Joe Biden refused to do. So nobody should have any nostalgia for Joe Biden.
Are you
He
able
had
to
a
talk? No,
Yeah, go ahead.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, but one thing I always hear are these propaganda lines about, oh, the JCPOA wasn't a good deal for America. That's the Trump line. I just hear it so much, and yet, everything I've read about the JCPOA was it was the best deal we were going to get.
Absolutely. The opposition, the Republicans say that JCPOA is a flaw, fatally flawed. That was what Trump said when he reneged on the deal, because they said it didn't deal with Iranian ballistic missiles, which actually was never part of the negotiation. And if it had been part of the negotiation, the reason it wasn't was that it was so complicated and so fraught for Iran to conceive of giving up its ballistic missile arsenal that the Americans, Obama said, okay, let's just take the missiles out of the equation and we can deal with them separately, which of course, once Trump withdrew, there was no way to either deal with the nuclear program or deal with the ballistic missiles. So that's another fatal flaw of withdrawing. I'm trying to think of what the other negatives they said. Oh, they also said at the end of 5 to 10 years that Iran would be able to build a nuclear weapon because that was a sunset provision of JCPOA. But the truth is that Iran still would have had provisions in the deal that would have been in perpetuity. No sunset provisions for those elements of the deal. So it's typical, like you said, it's propaganda. There's so much hostility and bile and bias against Iran that it's clouded everybody's judgment. And I think with someone like Trump, it's willfully clear, confusing him and his judgment because he doesn't want to understand or believe that negotiations will work. So he's not respecting that.
In terms of where we're at right now, I mean, I know a lot of people would say that the initial strikes on Iran were a major embarrassment for the Islamic Republic. And I do think there's truth to that, but I think this is also now going in the other direction a week or so later, where Iran has been left standing. And, you know, to be honest, if people are worried about Iran getting nukes, and I think that's a completely other question because I don't like this whole like the mad mullahs sort of narrative. I think that if Iran were to pursue nuclear weapons, it would be doing so as deterrence. And I think Iran has been relatively restrained and actually pretty rational in how it's dealt with the U.S. and Israel in ways that haven't always been repaid. I think they tried their best with the JCPOA. But now that Iran has been left standing, uh, and given what has happened, I don't see how the Islamic Republic can trust the U.S. and Israel. And I, I mean, to be blunt about it, it would seem rational for them to pursue nuclear weapons at this point. I don't know if you want to comment on any of that.
Yeah, I mean, I heard Trita Parsi, who's one of the great experts on Iran, has written many books on the subject,
He's a
and
friend
he
of the show.
said,
Yeah.
yeah, so good if you've had him on. He's great. So he said to Mehdi Hassan of Zateo that Iran will likely withdraw from IAEA, which is the International Nuclear group that monitors Iran's nuclear program
The
and other.
International Atomic Energy Agency. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so he believes they'll withdraw from it, and he believes that within 5 to 10 years, those were his terms, that Iran will have a nuclear weapon. And going back to what you were asking, Iran has the capability of building a nuclear weapon, but it has not gone to that step, that final step. And it is even at uranium enrichment of 60%, they're still not at the 90% level that they would need for a weapon. They can get there fairly quickly, but still, they've deliberately chosen to hold their enrichment level at 60%. And there's a fatwa that the Ayatollah Supreme leader issued years ago saying that Iran would never have a nuclear weapon. But that being said, if the Iranian regime believes it is threatened, which it was on the verge of during that Israeli attack, there's no question that for the sake of survival, that they would build a nuclear weapon. And we have brought that eventuality much closer with what we've done. If you have a 24-hour clock, I would say we're 5 minutes to midnight, or maybe even less, in terms of how close we are to that. And the fault is totally with Netanyahu and Trump. And they basically want this kind of confrontation because it looks like they look like sort of alpha male, silverback gorillas. And that's what they think appeals to the public. Without really, of course, in Netanyahu's case, he's hated by most of the Israeli public for lots of other reasons. And in Trump's case, he's hated because of his policies, domestic and foreign. And this isn't, I mean, 56% of the American public oppose the attack on Iran. Less than, I mean, 45% approve of it. But still, that's a majority that are opposed to what Trump did. And in Israel, they're opposed to Netanyahu's policy in Gaza. And I don't know whether they'd be opposed to what happened in Iran, but they're heavily they hate Netanyahu. So this kind of bellicose policy, this warlike aggression, which by the way violates the UN Charter and international law, the unprovoked aggressor attack on another state is a violation. It's a useless policy. It doesn't achieve anything except political theater.
With regards to what you said there about Israel and dislike of Netanyahu, is it? I want to be clear here because I'm not sure that in Israel the sentiment is, oh, this what we're doing in Gaza is bad because it's hurting Palestinians. I think there's other reasons that this is becoming an issue for Israel, the quagmire in Gaza that they're in.
Yeah. I agree. So I'm not saying that the Israelis are, out of the goodness of their heart, all of a sudden seeing the Palestinians as human beings or as their equal. I think that they treat Palestinians, basically as subhuman and not deserving of the same rights that they enjoy. But however, when it comes to their own welfare, Israelis are very sensitive to that. And the fact that they've lost over 3,000 soldiers during this period, and the fact that there are 40 or 50 living hostages inside Gaza, and that Netanyahu does not want to free them through a negotiation, and doesn't even want to free them under any terms, Israelis recognize that Netanyahu's approach is that, and that the hostages will never be freed as long as Netanyahu is in power, except dead hostages will be freed as military action happens in Gaza. And I should add that the Israeli military itself has killed hostages in attempts to kill Hamas commanders, or even maybe in attempts to free the Israeli hostages. So again, you have Israelis that hate Netanyahu also because of the judicial coup, which happened before October 7th, in which he tried to dismantle some key provisions of the Israeli state and Israeli democracy. I'm using that in quotes, and defanging the authority of the courts and various other measures that would have sort of eliminated any guardrails towards autocracy in Israel.
One thing that I have trouble with when talking about these subjects is people will I there are certain people that will immediately go to, but Iran does this and it goes against human rights and violations. But I think when we're talking about what Iran does domestically and what it does in terms of its own foreign policy and how it deals with, relations with the U.S. and Israel, I think they're two different topics and people conflate them. I don't know if you can speak to that because I really think people. I'm sorry, but I think the Islamic Republic has been really largely restrained when it comes to dealing with the U.S. Say what you will of whatever it does domestically.
Right, exactly. So, the line is that look at how Iran treats women, and the terrible incident that happened where a woman was killed by the the virtue police, for not wearing her veil properly, and then starting a series of protests in Iran by women. And also that the Iranians hang gay people, because that happened like 10 or 20 years ago. And those are terrible things, but they're domestic issues. So if you want to rail against Iran for that, that's one thing. But if you want to say that a country should be subject to mass bombings and assassinations of its key leaders, just based on the fact that you don't like its human rights approach, that's ridiculous. I mean, that's just like comparing apples and oranges. And also, it's incredibly ironic for Western white people to say that they're so concerned about human rights in Iran, and that somehow justifies the approach of Trump and Netanyahu. That's just patently ridiculous.
You mean just because of like looking at the U.S., look how many people we have just enmeshed in the prison industrial complex system,
Yeah,
imprisoned, incarcerated. Not just that, but we just, I mean, we're seeing a administration in this country that is taking away abortion rights.
yeah. I mean, look who doesn't really appreciate the rights of women and minorities and immigrants in this country. And now talk about Israel and Gaza. 70% of those 55,000, which is actually a much higher actual number, but the known number of dead, 56,000 Gazans, 70% of whom are women and children. So let's talk about a country that is mass murdering women, and then compare it to Iran's treatment of women, if you want to take the terms that they're setting out, which you and I both reject. So it's the height of irony, the height of what's the right word here? It's just the height of ridiculousness that they would try to use that as an argument against Iran.
In your most recent article about, Trump's whipsaw war, you brought up a case that I've never covered on this show, but I actually kind of wanted to talk about with you. And maybe we could talk about it in relation to what has happened over the past week and what it says about uh, Iran's technical capability. I'm talking about the Stuxnet attack, which you mentioned in the article. For my listeners, what was the Stuxnet attack, and why did you bring that up in relation to all of this?
Well, the Stuxnet attack was a Mossad operation in collaboration with U.S. intelligence that imported malware into the Iranian nuclear computer system that operated the centrifuges. And the malware was set to destroy the electrical connections that the centrifuges had. So instead of spinning, they spin very, very fast in order to purify the uranium. And instead of happening fast, they set the malware to make the centrifuges go out of control and break. So they trumpeted this as a huge victory that was going to set back the Iranian program or destroy the Iranian program or whatever. And the truth of them, and this was a very, an achievement, let's say, in terms of technology and the ability to sabotage through malware technology. It was really a sort of a pioneering, terrible, but a pioneering achievement technically. But however, the outcome was way short of what they expected. The Iranians developed centrifuges that replaced the ones that had been destroyed. Not only that, they improved the technology of the centrifuges so that they worked even more efficiently and even better. So and the same thing is going to happen here. That's what Lewis's article says. The Iranians are expert at producing these centrifuges. They produce like 100 new centrifuges every week. I think that's the number he uses. And that hasn't been degraded by these attacks. They have nuclear facilities all over the country, not just in the sites that the Israelis and the U.S. has claimed to have attacked. Iran has hidden nuclear sites. It's hidden the 700 kilograms of enriched uranium that hasn't been touched by any of these attacks. So Stuxnet was this initial attempt to degrade the Iranian nuclear program, which in the long run turned out to be a failure.
If you could, one thing I want to get into here is Trump just seems to be going back and forth with everything. Um, one second he's saying, he has JD Vance saying we're not for regime change, and then the next you have Trump on Truth Social saying, "Well, why is regime change bad? Make Iran great
Yeah,
again." And then you
yeah,
have him doing a ceasefire, which I don't even know. It doesn't seem like there was actually a formal ceasefire.
right.
Then, when Israel did a bombing during the 12-hour grace period, I believe, uh, Trump like lost his mind and said, how dare Israel do this? They dropped too many bombs. They went all out. And then he castigated both Israel and Iran, saying they don't know what the F they're doing. Um,
Mm-hmm.
what do you think is going on with Trump?
Well, he wants to be known as the consummate deal maker, the art of the deal, et cetera. All that. I don't know if I can say this word on your podcast, but all this bullshit about the art of the deal. So that's why he negotiated a ceasefire a while ago in Gaza, I think, or I can't remember what he did, but his negotiator negotiated some kind of a deal with Hamas, and he's working on one now, supposedly. Um, and I lost my train of thought here. Trump's a whip. That's why I use the term, by the way, whipsaw, because you go back and forth, and one day to the next, he changes his mind. And the reason he got so upset with Israel, I think, is that he knows or should know Israel's MO in agreement making agreements like this is that Israel violates them at will. Whenever it's convenient to Israel to violate a ceasefire, whether it's with Hamas or with Iran, it just goes right ahead and does so. It assassinates leaders when it has the opportunity to do so. It ignores any agreement. So Trump may realize that if we let Israel launch another attack on Iran, that the ceasefire will disappear, because Iran is not about to honor a ceasefire that Israel is breaking willfully. So he knows that the whole ceasefire is liable to go up in smoke once he lets Israel get by violating it in this way. So every once in a while he's like a broken clock. Twice a day he has the right time because the hands don't go around the clock. And
Well,
so every
do you
once in a
think
while,
also, not to interrupt you, but do you think also, I feel like maybe the reason he wanted a quote unquote ceasefire was, I think Iran was basically approving a motion to close the Strait of Hormuz. And that's like a major global shipping, you know, line,
yeah,
particularly for oil. So I'm
yeah.
wondering if he thought, oh my God, this would have consequences that would hurt me domestically, leading because of a surge in global oil prices.
Well, yeah, he's already got a economy that's going south, and I think he realized that there was a possibility if you close a major shipping lane for oil for the entire world in the Strait of Hormuz, that the economy tanks. I mean, we already have oil prices going sky high because of the threat of this happening, not even the actual event itself. So if this were to happen, it would be a tremendous blow to the world economy, for which Trump knows that he would be blamed. However, I think that Iran would be very careful about that. about doing it. That would have to be pretty serious circumstances for them beforehand, because it would cut off their oil as well, because the U.S. would not allow their ships to get through their own blockade. And that's one of their key sources of income globally is their oil trade. I don't know that Iran would make use of that, but it definitely is a menu item for them that they could use. I wanted to add something. I just was thinking about this a little, to the side of the topic you've been talking about, and that is what happens to to Iran's military and intelligence, and its nuclear program by the assassination of this entire senior level that the Mossad did. The leaders of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the military, at least 10 or maybe more scientists, the senior scientists were killed. How does that impact all of those elements of Iranian society? Well, Israel thinks that doing it will set back Iran's military and set back their nuclear program. And they even assassinated the negotiator who was negotiating with Trump about the nuclear program. So Israel thinks if we take them all out, Iran's going to be, we've chopped the head of the snake off, blah, blah, blah. But the truth of the matter is, and again, Trita Parsi said this in his interview, that those who replace them will be more radical, more intransigent, more aggressive than the figures that they replaced. So that, I believe, is true. And Israel has found that when it's assassinated leaders like Hezbollah, in 1992, they assassinated then Hezbollah leader. When they assassinated the founder of Hamas, who replaced them? People that were far more capable than they were, far more radical than they were. Iran is not going to sit back and grow flowers after this top echelon was eliminated. There was another story that I read in the Washington Post that the U.S. intelligence leaked this ridiculous story to the Washington Post, saying that the Mossad had called the generals at their home phones and warned them and gave them 12 hours to record a statement on Telegram that they renounced the state and they rebelled against it, and it claimed that had stopped the second level from being willing to step up and be promoted to the upper level. And I'm thinking, if they think it was that easy to get these middle level people, all of whom, by the way, have sworn allegiance to the government, if they think that's going to intimidate them, I don't know under what terms they believe that. You've got people who are true believers. It's the same thing in any country where the people who are doing national security are have sworn their allegiance to the interests of their country. They're not going to be afraid and by the way, Israel has never produced any of those videos, which means that they were never made. So everybody they tried to warn and said, we know where you live and we'll kill your children and we'll kill your wife. They never made a single video, which Israel, if it had one, would have produced it because they would have embarrassed the Iranians. So, there's that to consider as well.
So, going back to the initial topic that we brought up at the very beginning here about Fordow and the satellite images showing that, it doesn't seem to have been like completely annihilated in the way that Trump says it has been by those strikes. I just saw a piece of Newsweek that just came out 31 minutes ago. New satellite imagery shows Iran expanding work at Fordow nuclear site. Why do you think Trump went with this whole narrative of, we destroyed it, now we're done, and, things go back to normal? Like, what? I mean, is this a defeat? Like, what why do you think the U.S. is sort of making overtures to backing off now?
Well, let's talk about whether it's a defeat or not. You have Iranians in Iran celebrating the ceasefire. There are no Israelis celebrating the ceasefire.
Well, what I meant was, is this a defeat for the U.S. And Israel,
Yeah,
and
well,
is Trump trying to spin it?
yeah, absolutely. I was going to get to that. Yeah, it's a defeat for the United States when you claim that we've obliterated their nuclear program, just like they thought Stuxnet would set back their nuclear program by years. And at most, it set them back by 3 or 6 months. And the same thing here. You've got a country of 70 million people, and the government of that country sees its interests as having a nuclear program. You are not going to eliminate a nuclear program that covers a huge expanse of territory where they can put um, their parts of their nuclear program anywhere underground in Iran, and they can spirit away their enriched uranium, and they can. That's what Jeffrey Lewis said. There are sites that we don't even know about, where we don't even know what they're putting in there. And the fact of the matter that the IAEA cannot monitor what is happening, which they were able to do before the attack. So we're completely in the dark about what's going on with Iran's nuclear program. And going back to Trump, we all know he's a liar. We all know that truth is, he's basically a sociopath. And truth doesn't make a difference to him unless it's in his interest. So saying that look, Tulsi Gabbard, his supposed intelligence chief, said in a congressional hearing several months ago that Iran isn't producing a nuclear weapon. It's not going in that direction. And you have Trump now saying that it's been eliminated. And then Trump, when people say, but Tulsi said, that they're not. And he said, well, I don't believe anything she said.
And then, of course,
So
we have to add she sort of like fell in line and kissed
yeah,
Trump after that.
yeah. She said there's no daylight between me and Trump. So go figure if you can figure
I
what's
mean,
going on there.
what do you think? What do you think is at play when Trump has gone from regime change, make Iran great again, to, well, we hit this nuclear site, it's annihilated, even though it isn't, and we're done now. Like, I mean, it could just be Trump being, erratic, but I wonder if you think there's more going on there.
Well, I've heard
Like,
people
has the
say,
U.S. and Israel realized maybe they've come up against a wall with this?
no, I don't think so. I think what's important to note here is that it's in Bibi's interest, Bibi Netanyahu's interest, to have a hostile Iran, because if he's got this bête noire that he can always try to beat the drum of war, because Iran is a danger to the world, and Iran is the prime the primary font of terrorism around the world. And that's good for him because it makes Israelis feel frightened. It makes them feel that they need a tough, strong leader to protect them. And the fact of the matter is that Netanyahu isn't strong, he isn't tough, and he doesn't protect them. But he projects a mirage sort of that. He calls himself, Mr. Security. And that's why that's why this attack on Gaza happened, because he wanted to distract from the corruption trials that he's facing. And Iran is yet another sort of feather in his cap from his point of view. Now, the reality, if we want to talk about what's true here, is that this has failed. I think that's going back to what your question was, that the U.S. attack and the Israeli attack combined didn't achieve anywhere near what they thought it would. And one other thing I wanted to mention is that people who know Trump, who've been in the White House, say that the reason he flits back and forth from one perch to another is he works based on who was the last person who he talked to. So if the person he talked to gave him intelligence that went in a certain direction, that's the thing that he'll say to the media the next time he has an opportunity. But if in the interim somebody else comes in and says the opposite, and if that sounds good to him, that's what he's going to say. That's why there's no consistency in anything he says. But you have to add on top of that, he's a sociopath. So he can say things that are in his interest that are false, but he doesn't even know they're false because anything that's in his interest is true automatically. So it's kind of crazy psychological kind of profile going on here, but all of these different things combined to produce a failed foreign policy.
What do you think the biggest takeaways are from all of this? I mean, Iran is left standing at this point. It's interesting. I always hear like this talk every year. It seems that the Islamic Republic is just about to fall. It's about to fall. It's about, and then it doesn't happen. So, I
Yeah.
mean, what can we take away from all this?
Well, I wanted to take up one thing that you just alluded to, and that is that the goal here was regime change. Netanyahu wanted to overthrow the clerical regime in Iran, the government of Iran. Guess what? Didn't happen. And this 12-day war that was stopped by the ceasefire could never have overthrown the regime. So the truth of the matter is that Netanyahu wanted the war to go on long enough that he could spur regime change. At least that's what he claims. And that's why Trump claims at one point that he would be okay with regime change. But then, when they did the ceasefire, I think that's a tacit acknowledgement that it's not working and it's not going to get them what they want. So the takeaway here is your question is that that Iran, as you said, is still standing, that Iran can repair the damage done to its nuclear program, that Iran will continue with its nuclear program. It will. I don't want to project here because I don't have a crystal ball, but I don't think that there's going to be any deal on Trump's terms of completely eliminating their nuclear program. If Trump is willing to agree to a compromise, which he, by the way, there was a plan on the table that Iran did accept that would have allowed them to enrich uranium to 3% if they could keep the uranium. And that's what he agreed to that initially, and then he reneged on it because the Israel lobby and the Republicans got on him and said, no, you can't do this. So the takeaway here is that we will eventually be going right back to square one. We'll have the same situation that we had. We'll have maybe another attack in 5 or 10 years, or maybe sooner. And so it just repeats itself ad infinitum, unfortunately.
If you can stay a little bit longer, I wanted to ask you, we haven't talked about the Democrats in relation to all of this, and I think you have some criticisms of how Democrats handled all this, with some notable exceptions, but
Yeah, yeah, right. A few exceptions, but the exceptions were the exception to the rule. So yeah, you have Chuck Schumer, the octogenarian. I mean, I called him the gerontocracy. So I didn't invent the term. The Democrat and gerontocracy, where the average age of Congress is probably 70, 75. And then you have a handful of Democrats who are in their 40s, if that. So you have this sclerotic Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries in the House, and you have all these senators, John Fetterman and everyone, beating the drums of war, really overjoyed at the attack. Certainly all the Republicans, but you have even senators who received tons of money from the Israel lobby. And by the way, AIPAC wrote statements of support that the senators gave to the public. It wrote them for them. And AIPAC has been beating the drums of war too about Iran. So the Democrats have just rolled over and let the Republicans set the tone for this entire enterprise that has happened. And it's shameful because the Democrats could create an issue that, I mean, when they've got 56% of Americans disagree with Trump attacking Iran, where are the Democrats? Why don't they recognize that that is an election issue that they could go after? because they're afraid. They are afraid of the Republicans. They are afraid of Trump beating them up with it, and they don't trust the American people, basically. Now, I want to talk about, you mentioned the exceptions. So it's important to note that we have some members of Congress. We have Bernie Sanders, Rashida Tlaib, I assume Ilhan Omar, although I didn't hear her make this statement, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez coming out with strong statements. And I think, yeah, AOC called for his impeachment, called for Trump's impeachment based on invading Iran without a declaration of war. And there were a couple of senators like, is it Tim Kaine? Not Tim Kaine, but
No, I
Kaine,
think Tim Kaine
Tim Kaine
yeah.
of Virginia. He proposed a resolution that would have compelled Trump to get the approval of Congress before attacking Iran. And Rouhana in Congress did that with Thomas Massie, a Republican. So they all put forward these various resolutions, which, of course, were moot as soon as he did attack Iran. But these are fantastic, in my opinion, fantastic issues to take the public and during the midterms that are coming up in a year or so. And they've just let the whole thing slip through their fingers because they didn't want to deal with it. So why is there a Democratic Party if it can't really be in the opposition? It's supposed to be an opposition. And instead, it's like a pussycat. Nothing against cats, by the way. And it's just it's feeble and shameful. And that's why I hope in the next 2 years that the current leadership will, what's the right term here, will be defeated in primaries, or will step down, or will be challenged by younger people, because the youth of America, the younger generation, say 25 to 34, is even more opposed to Trump and to the Iran attack than the overall population is, that 56% I mentioned. So I don't know what the specific number is for young people, but I would be certain it would be 10 or 15% more among that generation. And that's why we need a younger generation to rise up in the Democratic Party. We need people like Zohran Mamdani, who just
I
won
was just
the
going to
mayor.
ask you for your thoughts on Zohran.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's a whole big kettle of fish to talk about. But Zohran Mamdani is 40-ish, 45, I think. And he represents the growing progressive spirit in the Democratic left of the party, which is being resisted by
He's 33, by the way.
33, I'm sorry, which is being resisted by the oligarchs on Wall Street, like Bill Ackman, who gave who created a PAC that gave $25 million to Cuomo of the 36 million that he raised. And by the way, Mamdani's take was $9 million compared to 36. So he spent 1/4 of the amount of money to win the mayoralty over Cuomo. And to show you how weak a candidate was, in February, Mamdani was polling at 1%, and he ended up getting 43% of the vote to Cuomo's 36%. So there is a constituency in the Democratic Party, if they played their cards right, and work to cultivate a younger generation of leadership, which they're not doing. They are sabotaging the younger generation. They are trying to eviscerate AOC and Sanders, and they're trying to destroy Mamdani as well. I mean, today you have Kirsten Gillibrand, a New York senator, going on an NPR interview and talking about Mamdani, who, by the way, never said he supported global jihad. That's one of their phrases that they trot out as being anti-Semitic among the Palestinian Solidarity movement. And using the term jihad in her interview 12 times to attack Mamdani, and basically calling him an anti-Semite because he believes that Palestine should be free. And the pro-Israel Jews and non-Jews are trying to use that as a cudgel to beat him over the head so that they can gradually wear down any support that he has. And as long as he turns out to be a good mayor who produces some of the platform that he has put forward, he will himself be able to beat down the opposition. But they are going to try with everything in their might. And you can be sure that if Cuomo decides to run on a third-party ticket, that he's not going to get 36 million. He's going to get 50 or 100 million. And Bill Ackman, the billionaire hedge fund manager,
he's
who, by
calling
the
for
way,
a writing candidate.
yeah, and he already has one identified, I believe, and that is Richie Torres, who's a quote unquote centrist Democrat who's young and who's black, or I think African American
He's
Latino.
very odd because he seems to talk more about Israel than his own district.
He doesn't talk about his district at all, or Democrat or domestic issues. He only talks about Israel because he gets tons of money from Israel lobby donors, and he is bought and paid for by the lobby. And by the way, I'm proud to say he's blocked me on Twitter, but he blocks anybody on Twitter who says anything negative about him. But I think Ackman has probably identified him as the guy who he'd like to recruit. And Ackman wrote like 1,000-word Twitter screed talking about the hundreds of millions of dollars he could easily raise for any good candidate who had the courage to step forward and take this huge step in their political career, and on and on and on. And everybody is saying, I think he's talking about Richie Torres. And the fact of the matter is, I don't think Richie Torres could be elected dog catcher in New York. I could be wrong about that, but he represents a district that is, part of it isn't even in New York City. And maybe none of it is. I don't know the exact district, but I know it's sort of north of New York City. So I don't think he has a base in New York City. I mean, yeah, he has a base of the Hasidic sects because the Rebbe's there tell all of their followers to vote as a bloc. And if it's Richie that they, that they are going for, so he's going to get some of that vote. But by the way, you have Eric Adams, the current mayor, running on a third-party ticket, and he's calling his party the anti-Semitism something party. So he's going to be trying to take some of that Hasidic vote as well. So they could cancel each other out in terms of the Jewish vote. And Mamdani, by the way, has Jews who support him. And there were rallies by Jews, anti-Zionist Jews, of whom there are more than a handful, by the way. Lots of pro-Israel people try to say, oh, the anti-Zionists are the far extreme left and they don't have any following and blah, blah, blah. More and more, by the way, especially among young people, especially after Gaza, are turning away from Zionism and turning away from supporting Israel. So I think that Mamdani is still going to be strong. He is going to face all of these attacks continuing, unfortunately, but I think that he probably can withstand them.
Just two more things here, real quick. We talked about that term regime change earlier, and the goal of Israel being regime change in Iran. But I think you've noted this as well. Is it really regime change, or is it really the aim of regime
Chaos.
collapse? Because
Yeah.
ultimately, it seems like a lot of the talk is, well, we don't even want to change the regime. Once it falls, we don't want to replace it with anything. Just let there be sectarian warfare everywhere, you know?
Absolutely. That's actually the geostrategy of Israel for decades, which is, let's try to get all of the different ethnic groups in Iran to be fighting each other. So there is a group called Jundala, which is the Shiite population, which is fairly small, but they want to. Their region is called, I think, Baluchistan. So they are rallying for independence, breaking away from Iran, and that. And there are other groups, by the way, who are also rallying for their own independence. That is what Israel wants. It wants what happened in Syria, which is dividing up the country into, in Syria was Alawites and Sunni and the Kurds, and there may be some other groups that I'm not aware of. But once they got to fighting with each other, and Syria turned into a total mess, Israel could control what was happening in Syria and attack Hezbollah, which was using Syria and an ally of Assad there. And that's what they want to do in Iran. They want to foment as much sabotage and unrest as they can. And they're delighted when there are protests in Iran. They're delighted when anything that happens that weakens the regime and the leadership. The fact of the matter is that whatever we think about this regime, which there are a lot of negatives and criticism that could be leveled, it's a very strong regime. And the only way to change it is to wait for internal political processes to happen that will hopefully transform it into something akin to a democracy. But regime change is not going to work. Military airstrikes are not going to work. By the way, airstrikes have never on their own succeeded in any military operation. Maybe you could say World War II, but they don't work. They didn't work in Vietnam. They didn't work in other conflicts where, maybe you could say they worked in Serbia and Kosovo because that was mostly an air war, but they're usually very ineffective. So but nobody has the patience to try to help make that happen. They want it to happen immediately. They want to destroy they want to topple their regime now, and they want to end the uranium. They want to end the nuclear program now. And that's just not the way the world works. And Iran is not going to be dismantled because Israel has a couple of Mossad agents inside or bombs Tehran or bombs nuclear sites. It's a piecemeal kind of thing that just in the long term doesn't work.
So the last thing I want to talk about is the work you've been doing looking at Shin Bet and how they've been arming and funding these Palestinian mercenaries from the Al-Shabaab clan. And I guess there's this group called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation that figures into all of this. It's a bit complex. If you're willing to get into just a little bit, I would really appreciate it. This is a sort of disaster humanitarianism.
Yeah. And before I get into the details of it, I want to note that Haaretz published a story, I believe yesterday, saying that soldiers in Gaza have told the reporter that their commanders have told them to shoot to kill Gazans lining up for food aid, even though the Gazans pose no threat to them. And I think something like 200 Gazans who lined up at these quote unquote humanitarian aid points of distribution have been murdered by the IDF. And it's worse than a dark irony is that Israel itself created this program in order to control the Gazans. It created the Gaza Health Foundation, and it had the Mossad set up the foundation in Switzerland because it could use all these secret methods of doing so. So it created this fictitious entity in Switzerland, and then it got an American billionaire. I don't know if you remember Rand McNally, who used to do all the maps of the world. So Ward McNally is this guy's name. He has a billionaire hedge fund. And so he gave, I can't remember whether the number was 120 million. He took an ownership stake in the company, his subsidiary company that actually owns or controls the foundation. So the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation itself is conceived by Israelis, former IDF officers and others who saw it as a way to control through humanitarian aid to control the Gazans. And the U.S. got involved. And going back, the Haaretz has found that the Ministry of Defense, the Israeli Ministry of Defense, is spending $140 million every month to sustain this project. The U.S. has announced, or somebody has announced, that they're going to get Arab states. So whenever there's a big expense involved, Israel says, "Oh, the Arab states are going to fund it," and they're saying the Arab states are going to fund this humanitarian aid project. Why they would do it, I don't know. They've already said, "Oh, the Arab states are going to provide all of the peacekeepers who are going to take over Gaza after they get rid of Hamas." And no Arab state has said that they're willing to do it. So the humanitarian aid project is an outrage. I mean, no humanitarian aid NGO in Gaza, like the World Food Program and like UNICEF and others that are actually providing or trying to provide food aid to Gazans, agrees with this or believes that it's a reasonable approach. They all are totally opposed to a humanitarian aid program that is controlled by the Israelis.
Yeah, so this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, again, it's what the Israel's Defense Ministry is like funding it at like $140 million per month.
Right, that's what I just said. And now going back to the Al-Shabaab aspect of this, so the Israeli military has Palestinian collaborators within Gaza who are basically gangsters. And Gaza and the West Bank is divided by clans. And so there's several clans in Gaza. Some clans are allied with Hamas, and other clans are allied with Fatah. And the ones that are allied with Fatah, Al-Shabaab is the name of the clan, are engaged in gangster things where they loot the aid trucks that are coming into Gaza, or they force the truck drivers to give them an average of $4,000 per load per truck as extortion money to allow them to pass. So the Israeli military has given Al-Shabaab weapons and told them that they want them to control the aid, the lines of Palestinians that are coming to these aid locations, and the Al-Shabaab group is also firing on and killing some of the Palestinians. And whenever they're under threat themselves, the Al-Shabaab, they retreat into Israeli IDF-held territory. So they're just using collaborators. And this is, by the way, an MO of Israel going back decades. They created these entities, like they actually helped create Hezbollah. They helped create Hamas because they were using them as a wedge against the PLO in most of these cases. And now they're using them as a wedge against Hamas. And they don't work in the long run. They just don't work, because no Palestinian in Gaza is going to say, "I want Al-Shabaab to rule me," because they're gangsters, they're terrorists. And they're also affiliated with Israel. So no Palestinian is going to want to see people like this run things. But Israel and the U.S. hope that they can have a strong man running. That's why they like this guy, Mohammed Dahlan, who was a former security person who was guilty of torturing people who were enemies of Fatah within the Palestinian community. So they're hoping that the strong man comes along, because Israel likes Arab strongmen because it can deal with them and negotiate with them.
Closing out here, does this also relate to? I have a lot of questions that listeners will ask me about the West Bank, and I think there's collaborators with Israel in the West Bank that people don't always. I mean, I'm talking about Fatah here. I don't know if you can speak to that, because my listeners have asked me about that on numerous occasions.
Well, yeah, Fatah is basically an extension of Israeli security apparatus. Fatah's and the PA, the Palestinian Authority security people, police Palestinians on the West Bank on behalf of Israel. So they are uh, basically, collaborating with Israel. And they also, there's no real governing authority in Palestine and in the West Bank. They don't exercise much control over anything that happens. And maybe you could say that Israel prefers it that way, but it also means that there can be more terrorist attacks coming into Israel because there is no authority in the West Bank. And it also allows the settlers, the Israeli settlers, to expel entire communities from the West Bank. So approximately 2,000 or so Palestinians who've lived in these villages for generations to be expelled from them. And there was a film that won an Academy Award. I forget the name of it, which documented the actions of the settlers in a group of 12 villages called Maser Yatta. And that's an excellent, people
No Other
should
Land.
watch that. No Other Land, they should watch that. It's a pretty remarkable film. And it documents what the settlers are doing in the West Bank, the impunity, the murder. There's a murder actually that take place in the course of that film. And the murders have happened routinely over the years and getting worse. The level of violence is getting worse. So there is ethnic cleansing going on, not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank too. But it's being submerged by the horror of Gaza. And by the way, Iran has submerged Gaza in the media universe. So Israel is really excellent as using things as diversions from whatever thing that they're involved with, which is causing them to lose face in the world. That's how manipulative they are.
I think one of the most important points that I may have missed, or that I at least want to reiterate, is with regards to Israel and use of proxies, well, whether it's Al-Shabaab or past proxies, there's a CIA term for what this can lead to, and it's called blowback. And I think that's important to think about because, as you say in the article, be careful what you wish for. Today's proxy can become tomorrow's mortal enemy. You can't control these proxies forever, and eventually they can turn on you.
Yeah, well, look at the Taliban in Afghanistan. That's what that great satirical movie that Tom Hanks was in about the congressman who first got the U.S. government to send weapons to the
Is that Charlie
Taliban.
Wilson's war?
Charlie Wilson's War, and because he was anti-Soviet, so he saw the Soviets as being the U.S. chief enemy, and therefore he funded the Taliban. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. The fact of the matter is, once the Russians were gone and the Taliban wanted to vie for control of Afghanistan, they became the U.S. mortal enemy. So the Taliban don't care who their enemy is. It's any foreign entity that wants to exert control in their country is their enemy. So that's why when we went into Afghanistan, we faced a quagmire and we failed ultimately, and the Taliban now control Afghanistan.
And
So
what's interesting is I think you even have mentioned that like Israeli experts even have warned of this.
yeah, I mean, there are some Israeli doves, even among the former generals, who, and there are Israeli former politicians like a fellow named Avram Berg, who are really prescient about this and see things clearly. Um, but the problem is they're in a tiny minority because Israel has progressively gotten worse and worse and more right wing. And so where their voices used to be kind of, a portion of the political debate, now it's being much more constrained by the right wing sentiment. So, yeah, there are lots of people. There's some journalists like Gidon Levy who see things very clearly and are basically hated by the majority of Israelis or a large section of the Israeli public because of their dovish views. But they're right. But the fact of the matter is, being right doesn't necessarily help if the entire country is arrayed against you and against your views and is willing to go walk off the plank, which is what Israel is basically doing.
I was also wondering, I'm sorry, I keep going here, but
All right.
I had to ask, what is with these figures like former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Olmert, and Yair Golan, sort of becoming much more critical of the Gaza war and how it's, at the very least, being executed? Because, like we said earlier, it may not have to do with, oh, we love the Palestinians, but it is interesting seeing figures like Olmert and Golan becoming critical of Netanyahu's security doctrine in a lot of ways. What do you think's driving that?
Well, I'm sorry to be cynical here, but Ehud Olmert has a habit of, when he was in power as prime minister, he did nothing uh, towards the objectives that he's talking about now. He had a chance to negotiate an entire peace agreement with Syria that would have solved everything. It would have returned some territory to Syria, but it would have guaranteed peace, and Assad, as a strongman ruler, would have enforced it. But what happened? So Hezbollah captured some Israeli soldiers in the north, and he went to war against Hezbollah. And that was, I think, the 2006 Lebanon war. So he, when he was in power, realized that if he was too dovish, he would lose the support of the electorate. So he did nothing. I think he made some kind of offer to Arafat that would give him 90% of the West Bank and Gaza. But Israel was going to retain 10%. And Yasser Arafat said, no deal. Now, though, when he's out of power, he's become a dove. And look, I appreciate somebody who's come to their senses and sees what's going on for what it is. And by the way, he's called what Israel is doing in Gaza war crimes, which is pretty astonishing for a mainstream or a former mainstream Israeli politician. But again, Olmert went to prison for corruption. So, he's not exactly seen as a powerful figure right now. And Yair Golan is another interesting personality, leading the so-called Zionist left. And he once made a speech when he was the deputy commander of the IDF, saying that what was going on in Israel reminded him of 1933 Germany and the onset of the Holocaust. And by the way, he was forced out of the IDF as a result, and he got involved with politics. But these are both liberal Zionists. And as you said, they don't really care about the Palestinians. And to really solve this problem, and which I think the only solution is a one-state solution. But to have a one-state solution, you have to acknowledge that Palestinians are going to have equal rights with Israeli Jews. If you're not willing to acknowledge that, if you're not willing to see the Palestinians as equal human beings deserving of rights, then we might as well go home. And you even have like famous authors like David Grossman, very famous, written many novels that have been translated into English, and he lost his son in the Lebanon War, by the way. So, he suffered a great deal, and he considers himself in the opposition as well. But even though these people are seen as heroes on the left in Israel, they are only willing to go up to a certain point, and they will not go beyond that point. And as long as Israelis stop at that point and don't go farther, Israel is, the word I'm thinking of. I can't say it on air. You mentioned the F word before. That's what I'm thinking in the past tense. So yeah, Israel is in deep shit. I hope I can say that word. And it won't get worse. Won't get better. Because there is no threat that the opposition is going to take over. You even had a right-wing politician, Naftali Bennett, who was prime minister for a year or so, and he was actually decent as a prime minister, semi-decent. But no character like this is going to, replace
Well,
Netanyahu.
I guess my question is, why do they at least make overtures towards, like, do they see the way the Gaza war is being executed as being bad for Israel in the long run? Like are people like Golan and Olmert maybe worried about how this like hurts Israel on the national stage? Like, what's the impetus for their thinking?
Well, yeah, I think they're enlightened up to a point, and they see Israeli interests as being a member of the world community, both for things like trade and finance and reputation, cultural reputation. They want Israel to be a member of the global community. And they're enlightened enough to understand that that's not going to happen if Israel is at war with everybody at every time, all the time. So that's one of the reasons why they oppose the war in Gaza. But I have to say that most Israelis on October 8th supported what Israel was doing. They didn't support maybe, genocide and 56,000 Gazans killed, but I would bet that if you did a poll and you asked them if committing genocide would solve the security problems with the Palestinians permanently, would you favor doing that? And I think that the majority would say yes. But now you have other conditions going on here where you have all of these Israelis who've lost their children, both on October 7th and as hostages who were killed afterward. And there's a huge level of sympathy for the parents and the survivors of these hostages. And there were 250 hostages taken, and now there are only 40 left alive. Some of them they were freed during earlier ceasefire, but most of them were killed. And so those Israelis feel great sympathy for the hostage families. And as a result, they want the war to end and they want Netanyahu to go. So they're not peaceniks and they're not doves, but at least they have enough foresight or intelligence to understand that the only way to deal with this right now is to end the war and get the hostages back.
I want to thank you again, Richard Silverstein, especially because you stayed on a little bit longer than maybe expected. You're very gracious with your time. Thank you again, and how can my listeners keep up with your work?
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I don't get a huge amount of media interest, unfortunately, because of the views that I have. But I do appreciate it so much when media people like you have me on. So to reach my work, I have a blog called Tikun Olam, and the URL for my blog is richardsilverstein.com. And I also contribute to Jacobin magazine. Some of your listeners may know of it, and to two other publications called The New Arab and Middle East Eye. But my regular publishing happens at Tikun Olam. So I hope people will come visit online.
This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, WV, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Darko, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Merisham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Saded 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said,
until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.